Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, and I want to talk about an interesting poem that I found recently. One that is about Abraham Lincoln and Indigenous Americans. I am referring to 38 by Layli Long Soldier. For those who don't know, Layli Long Soldier is an Oglala Indigenous American from the Oglala people. She has been writing for the past 15 or so years, is primarily focused on Indigenous Americans and hypocrisies in government and things like that. And they've won a number of awards as well. And I don't know much else about this writer. This is my first time encountering them, but I really liked what I've read so far, even if it doesn't necessarily meet the traditional form and function of poetry. She still has quite a bit to say in a very interesting way of saying it. So without further ado, let's talk about 38. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. 38. Here the sentence will be respected. I will compose each sentence with care by minding what the rules of writing dictate. For example, all sentences will begin with capital letters. Likewise, the history of the sentence will be honored by ending each one with appropriate punctuation, such as a period or question mark, thus bringing the idea to momentary completion. You may like to know, I do not consider this a creative piece. I do not regard this as a poem of great imagination or a work of fiction. Also, historical events will not be dramatized for an interesting read. Therefore, I feel most responsible to the orderly sentence, conveyor of thought. That said, I will begin. You may or may not have heard about the Dakota 38. If this is the first time you've heard of it, you might wonder, what is the Dakota 38? The Dakota 38 refers to 38 Dakota men who were executed by hanging under orders from President Abraham Lincoln. To date, this is the largest legal mass execution in U.S. history. The hanging took place on December 26, 1862, the day after Christmas. This was the same week that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In the preceding sentence, I italicize "same week" for emphasis. There was a movie titled Lincoln about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was included in the film Lincoln. The hanging of the Dakota 38 was not. In any case, you might be wondering, why were 38 Dakota men hung? As a side note, the past tense of hang is hung, but when referring to the capital punishment of hanging, the correct past tense is hanged. So it's possible that you're asking, why were the 38 Dakota men hanged? They were hanged for the Sioux Uprising. I want to tell you about the Sioux Uprising, but I don't know where to begin. I may jump around and details will not unfold in chronological order. Keep in mind I am not a historian. So I will recount facts as best as I can, given limited resources and understanding. Before Minnesota was a state, the Minnesota region, generally speaking, was the traditional homeland for Dakota, Anishinaabe, and Ho-Chunk people. During the 1800s, when the U.S. expanded territory, they purchased land from the Dakota people as well as other tribes. But another way to understand that sort of purchase is, Dakota leaders ceded land to the U.S. government in exchange for money or goods, but most importantly, the safety of their people. Some say that Dakota leaders did not understand the terms they were entering, or they never would have agreed. Even others call the entire negotiation trickery. But to make whatever it was official and binding, the U.S. government drew up an initial treaty. This treaty was later replaced by another, more convenient treaty, and then another. I've had difficulty unraveling the terms of these treaties given the legal speak and congressional language. As treaties were abrogated, broken, and new treaties were drafted, one after another, the new treaties often referenced old defunct treaties, and it is a muddy, switchback trail to follow. Although I often feel lost on this trail, I know I am not alone. However, as best as I can put the facts together, in 1851, Dakota Territory was contained to a 12-mile by 150-mile long strip along the Minnesota River. But just 7 years later, in 1858, the northern portion was ceded, taken, and the southern portion was conveniently allotted, which reduced Dakota land to a stark 10-mile tract. These amended and broken treaties are often referred to as the Minnesota Treaties. The word Minnesota comes from Mni, which means water, and soda, which means turbid. Synonyms for turbid include muddy, unclear, cloudy, confused, and smoky. Everything is in the language we use. For example, a treaty is essentially a contract between two sovereign nations. The U.S. treaties with the Dakota Nation were legal contracts that promised money. It could be said this money was payment for the land the Dakota ceded, for living within as assigned boundaries a reservation, and for relinquishing rights to their vast hunting territory, which in turn made Dakota people dependent on other means to survive: money. The previous sentence is circular, akin to so many aspects of history. As you may have guessed by now, the money promised in the turbid treaties did not make it into the hands of Dakota people. In addition, local government traders would not offer credit to Indians to purchase food or goods. Without money, store credit, or rights to hunt beyond their 10-mile tract of land, Dakota people began to starve. The Dakota people were starving. The Dakota people starved. In the preceding sentence, the word starved does not need italics for emphasis. One should read the Dakota people starved as a straightforward and plainly stated fact. As a result, and without other options but to continue to starve, Dakota people retaliated. Dakota warriors organized, struck out, and killed settlers and traders. This revolt is called the Sioux Uprising. Eventually, the U.S. cavalry came to Minnesota to confront the uprising. More than 1,000 Dakota people were sent to prison. As already mentioned, 38 Dakota men were subsequently hanged. After the hanging, those 1,000 Dakota prisoners were released. However, as further consequence, what remained of Dakota territory in Minnesota was dissolved, stolen. The Dakota people had no land to return to. This means they were exiled. Homeless, the Dakota people of Minnesota were relocated, forced, onto reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. Now every year a group called the Dakota 38 plus 2 riders conduct a memorial horse ride from Lower Brule, South Dakota to Mankato, Minnesota. The memorial riders travel 325 miles on horseback for 18 days, sometimes through sub-zero blizzards. They conclude their journey on December 26th, the day of the hanging. Memorials help focus our memory on particular people or events. Often memorials come in the form of plaques, statues, or gravestones. The memorial for the Dakota 38 is not an object inscribed with words, but an act. Yet, I started this piece because I was interested in writing about grasses. So there is one other event to include, although it's not in chronological order, and we must backtrack a little. When the Dakota people were starving, as you may remember, government traders would not extend store credit to Indians. One trader named Andrew Myrick is famous for his refusal to provide credit to Dakota people by saying, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass." There are variations of Myrick's words, but they are all something to that effect. When settlers and traders were killed during the Sioux Uprising, one of the first to be executed by the Dakota was Andrew Myrick. When Myrick's body was found, his mouth was stuffed with grass. I am inclined to call this act by the Dakota warriors a poem. There is irony in their poem. There was no text. Real poems do not really require words. I have italicized the previous sentence to indicate inner dialogue, a revealing moment. But on second thought, the words "let them eat grass" click the gears of the poem into place. So we should also say language and word choice are crucial to the poem's work. Things are circling back again. Sometimes when in a circle, if I wish to exit, I must leap and let the body swing from the platform out to the grasses. And so that was 38. In terms of analysis, there's a fair bit to talk about with this poem. In terms of like narrative, it's the author talking about a historical moment, the 38 Dakota warriors hung in the uprising because they were starved, because they were put on reservations and their rights were taken away. Layli Long Soldier highlights the preceding events as well as other sorts of things, including the irony of someone who was terrible to these indigenous Americans getting their comeuppance. which you might argue didn't make things better. It was wrong, but personally, I believe that if you are going to be a horrible human being, then horrible things should happen to you. And if that results in your death, well, you should have thought twice. Some people might take offense to that, but I don't want to police what the oppressed do to their oppressors. That's not my business. So it's a very interesting sort of subject of this poem. It should be noted that this poem doesn't follow the traditional kind of poetic structure. I think Long Soldier kind of lays that out at the beginning of the poem. They say, "Here the sentence will be respected." And they talk about like what they will do. And they say, "I do not consider this a creative piece. I do not regard this as a poem of great imagination or a work of fiction." And I think this really helps the poem, even though I don't think Long Soldier would call this a poem. If you've made it flow with words and such as a traditional poem did, you might lose the ultimate meaning and the emphasis of the poem. I think writing out as sort of a prose style kind of highlights exactly what happened to these Dakota warriors, why they did what they did, and why the Dakota were lashing out to begin with. It's very straightforward and to the point. Sometimes you need to do that with poems. And that's what Long Soldier has done with their other work. Very straightforward, telling you exactly what they mean to say. Because sometimes people don't really understand symbolism. Sometimes people don't understand metaphors. And if you bury what you're trying to say in a metaphor, again, it sometimes loses meaning. That's interesting about the poem. And then the last thing worth noting is the circular nature of the poem, constantly referring back to other aspects earlier in the poem or pointing out something later in the poem. And specifically noting that history is kind of circular, that it follows up or comes back around in the end. Like as they say at the end of the poem, they say things are circling back again, noting that that Andrew Myrick, his death was an irony, and she's like talking about language and word choice, and that refers back to the beginning of the poem. So it's all leading towards somewhere, and I also happen to like how it acknowledges that a lot of people consider Abraham Lincoln a great person, but he executed 38 warriors. He was essentially killing indigenous people, participating in this unjust, oppressive system, and even though he freed one group of people, he was still oppressive to another. So he's maybe not as pure and good-hearted as some people necessarily think he is. A lot of our leaders in America have been troublesome people, awful people, and like they've only benefited the establishment rather than minorities or people who've been on the margins. Anyway, those are my thoughts on 38 by Layli Long Soldier, a pretty solid poem, one that I definitely recommend that you seek out. I'll put a link to it in the description so that you can read it. I do think it's pretty essential. If you have any thoughts on it, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this poem or this poet if they don't already know, and maybe also find out about Poetry Thursday as well. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and indigenous rights travels. Farewell.